guys, this is Miss Holland Chambers at Holland Chambers Biology coming to you with a lecture on the evidence of evolution. So what are some things that we as evolutionary biologists actually look at in order to determine if something has evolved? Now keep in mind, I am going to be talking about two things in our class. Number one, the transition to evolving, and then number two is how we can actually not evolve. And so that's going to be coming a little bit later. So number one is embryology. Now, embryology is the study of embryos. And so we call that comparative embryology, where we're going to compare the embryos of different species. Now, there is a major disclaimer here because back in the 1900s, when this first started to come about, you had a German scientist over here, Ernest Haeckel, who actually fudged his artwork to actually fit Darwin's theory that things were all, organisms were all related. And that actually was untrue. And so today what we're going to be looking at is more something like this, where you actually have a barnacle and a shrimp. So here's the barnacle, this one's the shrimp. And so that comparative anatomy of, are they related, are they not related, kind of what's going on. Regardless though, we do find in various animals, whether you are a fish, a human, a dog, or even a frog, that we all are born with or start with in the embryonic period, gill slits, which are on the side, the notochord, which is part of your spinal cord, and then we all actually start with a tail. Humans, our tail gets kind of caught up or reduced into our tail bone, so there's no longer a tail there. But there is a mutation out there where you can actually be born with a little bit of a tail. That's part of your spinal cord that hasn't got brought up into your skeletal frame. Number two is when we look at evidence, we want to look at where these organisms were found. So, over here you have, South America and Africa. There's a specific fossil that was found on both of these continents. You also have another fossil over here as a freshwater reptile that was found on both continents. So we can then use the fossils to deduce that these continents were at one time one. And that's where our idea of Pangea comes into place. The next one I want to look at is this guy right here. This is actually Harriet, which was a Galapagos tortoise. That was supposedly 176 years old. Steve Irwin had him in Florida. He died, probably 10 years ago. But he was one of the oldest animals that we had on land. And so when we look at biogeography, if you guys look at the Galapagos Islands over here, you can see that there's a whole bunch of various tortoises, so like the Galapagos tortoise, but all their shells were slightly different. And so because they are tortoises, they must have come from some common ancestor, and then when they got isolated onto the islands, they eventually started to evolve, adapt, and change. Now, the third thing that we want to look at when we look for have things evolved, are they related to so-and-so, what's going on, is obviously your DNA. And so remember, it's not just nuclear DNA, which is DNA that's found in the nucleus, but you also have mitochondrial DNA, which you can see over here on this side is DNA that we follow through the mother's line. And so you guys had a great example of that when you did forensic studies on Princess Anastasia. You guys were looking at the mitochondrial DNA to figure out if Annie Anderson was actually her. We're also going to take a look at amino acids and proteins. If we have similar amino acids, which in turn make a similar protein, then maybe if our proteins are similar, then we are somewhat either related or have a common ancestry. The third thing we actually look at as evolutionary biologists are these things called pseudogenes. Now, pseudogenes are part of the DNA that are no longer used, but they're still in there. We just don't use them. So if we have similar pseudogenes, then maybe we might actually have a common ancestry. Now, keep in mind, I want to kind of hold the conversation here for a second. Just because you might have similar embryology, or just because you might be found near other ancestors, doesn't necessarily mean that you are related or have evolved from them. Okay, so when we as evolutionary biologists go through this system of figuring out, are these organisms related or not, we want to look at all of them. Okay, so it's not just one or the other. You can't just pick and choose. So we have to verify embryology, check. Biogeography, check. DNA, check. And so as we go through this, this is what I want for you guys to kind of understand. We actually monitor all these aspects. Now, the fourth thing that we're going to look at as evidence for evolution is the physical anatomy. Now, there's 3 types that we can actually analyze: homologous, analogous, and vestigial. Homo in Latin means the same. So that means that their bones up here on the top are the same humerus, the same radius, the same ulna. However, their function is different. So on a human, our hand has the same bones as a whale's flipper. They're actually the same bones. The whale's flippers are a little bit longer, but a whale's arm made its flippers, whereas our bones made our hand. So because we actually have similar bones, it implies that we might have had a similar ancestor. Now, ana in Latin means not. So analogous structures are not the same, but they have similar function. Okay, so they're not the same. A wing on a bat is made of skin, whereas a wing on a bird is made of feathers. So those are obviously not the same. Feathers and skin are not the same. However, they have the same function, which means that they fly. So again, just because something flies doesn't mean that you're necessarily related to it. So a seagull most likely is not going to be related to, say, a grasshopper who also flies. Okay, so those are analogous structures. We also want to look at, and this one is actually most important, is vestigial. Okay, so vestigial, I want you guys to think about as a V, vestigial, which actually looks very similar to your pelvic bone, which is actually shaped as a V. These are remnants of the past. So as a whale who swims its whole life in the ocean, why would it have a pelvic bone? Well, that means that at one time, its ancestors, think about this, guys, we have a pelvic bone. Our pelvic bone is connected to our legs, right? And our legs are connected to our feet. Therefore, we walk. Whales don't walk, okay? So why would they have a pelvic bone still today? Well, that means that their ancestors actually walked. And so this is a remnant of the past, and then we can actually track the lineage of evolution. And we've actually done that. You guys are going to be watching an awesome movie called Great Transformation about whale evolution. And we actually found a whale called Basilosaurus in the Sahara Desert with a pelvic bone and little tiny legs and little tiny feet. And so that means at one time, whales used to be land animals and then transitioned into the sea. Okay, now the very last thing we're going to be looking at is fossils. Now, fossils, you are going to have a whole lecture about this separately, but as a brief overview, when we look at things from the past, so whether it was a footprint or a bone or the actual animal itself, we can therefore correlate that to similar animals that we have today. Okay, so trace fossils are fossils that are, you can trace a pattern, a movement. They, footprints in the mud. You also have cast fossils or natural casts, which means that the animal kind of made an impression in the mud, and they might actually not be there anymore. It's just a kind of like a print. Or you might actually have the actual organism that's been kind of hardened over time, water and all that got into the pores in the bone, and it actually made the bone hard like a rock. And so that's permineralization. So that's where we get a lot of our dinosaur bones, is from permineralization. Classic Jurassic Park is amber. The bug got stuck right into the tree sap. So as the sap is coming down the tree, the bug got stuck and then it hardened. And then over billions of years, we uncovered it with our archaeological digs. And we actually have the real thing in the amber preserved fossil. And we can correlate that bug or that specific organism to today's organisms as well. The last is the original. So this is like the classic woolly mammoth found in frozen ice. Or maybe mummies, that we actually have the actual people that have been mummified, whether it was in a bog or frozen or whatnot. We actually have the original remains. And so all of this leads us into, especially with amber preserved fossils and the original remains, is that if we have ancient organisms and we can actually extract blood out of those organisms, now we're talking genetic engineering, cloning, and possibly bringing back these extinct organisms into the present. And that's a whole nother debate. So hopefully this helped you guys out. Again, please make sure that you guys know and understand the 5 pieces of evidence that we use in evolution. Again, number 1 is embryology. Number 2, biogeography. Number 3, we're going to look at DNA. Number 4 is anatomy. And again, we don't just look at one or the other. We look at all of these. And number 5 are fossil remains. Thanks again for watching, and stay tuned for more Hole in Chambers biology lectures.